Now we're going to go into a little bit more detail around the LPA and the record keeping, because good records and systems are the foundation of the integrity system. The webinar is really going to be around record keeping and what you need to do to meet your requirements as part of LPA, and importantly, hopefully go away with some practical tips that will help you do that. So I guess when it comes to record keeping for LPA, there really is no perfect formula when it comes to record keeping, and hence we ask that question because there are a myriad of ways that you can keep your records. In terms of how some producers find that keeping clear notes in a diary or a record book works well for them, others tend to keep their records within farm management software program or computer spreadsheets. And regardless of the method, it's important that all the relevant management activities are accurately and clearly recorded and capture the required information. And should you be required to participate in an LPA audit, your LPA records will be reviewed by an auditor. So it's important to make sure that they're accurate and up to date. It's particularly important producers get records in order well before an audit. An audit is not the time to do this or to suddenly go in a mad flurry to try and get your records in order. And neither should an audit be the only motivation for keeping records. Providing lifetime traceability and record keeping can also be a marketing advantage for you as you're wanting to sell or transfer livestock as well, if you're able to tell a story around those animals. But to make it easier for you, ISC's created record keeping templates which are aligned to the 7 LPA requirements and outline all the information that you need to be recording. Now, these are available on the ISC website, and you can see there that we've got a little integrity insight on the slide. We've got a couple of those throughout tonight's webinar. So keep your eye on those, but as Dee said, we'll be sending out a fairly detailed post-webinar email as well with a whole heap of tips and resources as well. You can order those through the LPA website as well, or you can call customer service and the number's there on the screen if you'd like a hard copy. But I guess the other thing just to keep in mind with record keeping is that don't think of record keeping just in isolation of LPA. You'll be keeping records across other aspects of your business. There's an opportunity to keep those together or for other programs. And we'll talk about some of the SA requirements later on, and you'll see that particularly around biosecurity and things like that, you don't have to do a separate biosecurity record keeping for one program versus the other. They should all be quite complementary in the way that you keep those records. A recent change has been made to the LPA, so the Livestock Production Assurance website, and it now allows all your LPA documentation and records to be saved directly within your LPA account. Now, our integrity insight for this new feature is the option to also complete your property risk assessment and farm biosecurity plans entirely digitally rather than on a printed template, so you can actually do them from scratch. The benefits of keeping your record keeping in your LPA account is that it has all your records in one location. You can retrieve them at any time, and of course there's easy access for auditing. We've got a fact sheet for how to create or upload documents in your LPA account, and that's on the ISC website. And again, keep an eye out for that post-webinar email. In terms of the different types of records that you might be required to keep as part of the integrity system, there's usually two main types of records. There's records that we refer to which are property management records. Now these are completed and reviewed once a year, for example. These are things like the property risk assessment, the biosecurity plan, and your animal welfare certification. And the other types of records are what we'd refer to as operational records. Now these are things that are usually filled out daily or weekly, and are activity based and can include things like your visitor registers for biosecurity, feed and livestock treatment records as you're doing them, commodity vendor decks as you're receiving stock feed, and then your national vendor decks and your livestock movements. Now there are there's plenty of opportunities to utilise your current record keeping systems for the purposes of LPA, and that's totally fine. So there's no need to create duplicate records using the LPA templates if you've got a current system that can be utilised. So the important thing is that you just understand what's required from an LPA record keeping, and then to make your record keeping that you do on your farm fit that purpose as well as any other records you're required to keep. And a good example of that is around your chemical records as part of chemical treatments. So what I'm going to do now is take a look at each of the 7 different requirements for the LPA and take you through basically what you need to do to meet the requirement, and then to give you some examples of some record keeping templates or some practical tips. So the first LPA requirement we're going to have a look at is property risk assessments. Now, for this requirement, you must identify any possible risk on your property where livestock could come into contact with physical and or chemical contaminants, and you need to develop strategies for how this risk will be controlled or managed. To meet this requirement, you need to complete a risk assessment and a map. You need to update the risk assessment when changes occur on farm. You need to document and file the risk assessment and map for auditing, and this can be done completely digitally in your LPA account. Now, here's an example risk assessment map, and this is available as part of our record keeping templates. A risk assessment must be carried out when any changes to the enterprise's current activities occur, such as a change in land use on the property, for example. It requires that you mark on a property map any suspect areas, such as old yards or dip sites, treated yards, old rubbish dump sites, treated power poles and things like that. And you can see those risk areas marked on the examples on the screen. Here's another example from the ISC record keeping template. This is an example where risks are documented and a description provided of how the site is being managed to eliminate the risk of contamination. And you can see that the first example there is an old rubbish dump. So the types of information that you're capturing as part of your risk assessment is what the possible risk or the risk site was and referring to it on the property map, the reason or the risk that was identified, any results or analysis that you may have done that would just add further information to what the risk is and how you're going to manage it, and then a little description of how the site is being managed to eliminate the risk, which is of livestock contamination. So the first one there is a rubbish dump. The risk was around old chemical drums and batteries. There's been some soil samples done, which is identified dieldrin and BHC, so you're just putting that information in there. And then your risk mitigation is around the rubbish dump was fenced out in 2005 to keep animals from accessing that particular risk. So the next requirement for LPA that we're going to look at is biosecurity. So for this requirement, you must implement on-farm biosecurity systems to minimise the risk of infectious disease being introduced to livestock production properties and the subsequent spread of any of those diseases. Now, to meet this requirement, you're required to keep a formal documented farm biosecurity plan. And this can be completed digitally in your LPA account now. You need to source a livestock health declaration or equivalent for introduced livestock. You need to have systems to notify unusual disease, illness or mortalities. And you should also keep records of movements of people, vehicles and equipment entering your property where it's both reasonable and practical. Now, just a note there that some producers may have also completed a JBAS or a Yoni's farm biosecurity plan, and this will also meet your LPA requirements. And if, as I said earlier, you've used another program or a template to create a biosecurity plan, and there are plenty of biosecurity templates out there, just make sure that it covers all the required information that's required from the LPA template to make sure you're compliant with that. But then absolutely you can use a different biosecurity template for other requirements or for other programs such as state-based biosecurity as well. So here's an example of from the ISC record keeping templates. It's a formal documented farm biosecurity plan, and it must address things like managing and recording the introduction and movement of livestock in a way that minimises that risk of introducing disease. Where reasonable and practical, as I said, controlling people, equipment and vehicles entering the property, thus minimising the potential for property contamination of pest diseases and weeds, and keeping a record of those movements, and preventing and controlling animal disease on farm by regulatory monitoring and managing the livestock. Now, the key with biosecurity is to focus on what's relevant to your farm and your production system and any specific requirements that relate to your state and territory. It doesn't mean that you need to tick every box on the template, because some things may not be applicable to your situation. The important thing to consider is that is identifying what risks apply to your farm, and that with your business risk appetite, how you're going to manage those risks. So a good example, and as I said, biosecurity depends on the risks, it depends on your system and depends on your location. So just a practical example. So here we are superfine wool producers. I've actually got 7 neighbours and I've got a river that goes through the property as well. Most of the neighbours are on small holdings and certainly don't have merinos, so have crossbred sheep as well. So our biggest concern is the introduction of lice from neighbouring properties and also weeds which are travelling down through the watercourses. So big biosecurity things for us are boundary fencing and regular weed control and inspection. Now that may not be of any relevance to others in a much more extensive operation, same as certain things such as batteries and old dip sites and things like that are not of relevance to our system. So biosecurity, definitely not a one size fits all. There's definitely no correct answers. It really is around identifying the risks for your operation and how you're going to manage those yourself. And the important thing is that it's documented. And the other thing with biosecurity is that producers have been managing biosecurity for years. It's just now that we are simply asking for that to be documented so that we can tell a story to our customers that say that our producers are taking biosecurity seriously and that they are proactively managing that risk. Now on the screen we've got an example of a property visitor register. This is one of the record keeping templates that's available on the ISC website. You can, as I said, use one of these templates or set it up in a spreadsheet, and the information that's captured there is simply the date, the name, the company where the visitor came from, their signature, contact details, the reason for the visit, where they visited on the farm, they might have only been in certain areas, and the time in and time out. And of course, this is not only so that you can document it to say that you've documented, but it also, of course, helps you manage any issues as they arise. The next requirement that we'll look at for LPA is around animal welfare. Now, animal welfare is a really important requirement of LPA, which was introduced in 2017. To meet this requirement, you need to have a copy of the animal welfare standards and guidelines accessible as a reference. Now, the person responsible for the property or the person that has the LPA accreditation must have received training in the standards and guidelines, and that can be done through the LPA learning program. And staff involved in livestock husbandry on the property need to be familiar with the contents of the standards and guidelines and have been trained in a manner consistent with those standards and guidelines. Now, the integrity insight there is to download those standards and guidelines and save it as a favourite or bookmark it so that all your team members know where it is and that they can access it. And we'll send you that link around following tonight's webinar. Now, here's an example of the animal welfare certificate that's generated after you've done the LPA learning and the assessment process, and you need to have that as part of your records and available should you be asked to participate in an LPA audit. Now, the next requirement that we're going to look at is around safe and responsible animal treatments. Now, for this requirement, you must undertake steps to ensure that animal treatments are administered in a safe and responsible manner that minimises the risk of chemical residues and also physical hazards. Now, to meet this requirement, you need to document and file all animal treatment details. You need to complete a chemical user course. Note when equipment used for livestock treatment is cleaned. You should record authorisation and directions for any off-label use of chemicals. You need to note animals that have been exposed to any physical contaminants like broken needles, and you must mark animals treated with HGPs with a triangular earmark. Now, the integrity insight there is to keep those records for a minimum of 3 years in accordance with your state legislation or for the time the livestock are on the pick, whichever is the longest, because of course when you need to complete your NBD you may need to look back at those records to accurately fill out your national vendor deck. So here on the screen, this is an example of a livestock treatment record, and as I said earlier, of course these can be done in hard copy online. You can get this in online, or you can certainly copy it straight across into a spreadsheet, and the same type of information is also captured if you're using farm management software. The information you need to record is the treatment date, the description, the location and number of livestock, the trade name or the chemical details, the batch number, the dose rate that you used, the withholding period and ESI, and then a date that they're safe for slaughter and treated by. And these types of, particularly that information there around dates safe for slaughter, it just helps you keep an easy, ready reckoner when you need to go and move those animals, and you're not having to sort of calculate as you're down at the yards trying to load sheep or cattle and working out whether or not they're still in a withholding period. So it's handy just to capture that information. You know that the days that they're going to actually be safe for slaughter. So the integrity insight there, a couple of tips for this one. You can ask your supplier to add the vet product batch number and expiry date and the withholding period or ESI to the invoice for your treatment records, and you can just keep that as well. And if you don't know what the withholding period or the ESI is, you can visit the APVMA website. You don't need to remember that. We'll circulate that link later on. And just be careful, because withholding periods and export slaughter intervals are regularly not the same. And another little tip there, you can, as I said, you can get your supplier to provide you with those information on your invoice. But don't forget that we've all got smartphones now, and you can take a photo of most things. So something else you can do, and because photos, of course, are date stamped on smartphones, it's also very handy because you know what the treatment date might have been. Take a photo of the drum of chemical, for example. You can have the mob of sheep in the background. If they're looking at you, you'll get their tag color, so you'll know their age and probably the mob as well. So there's your record keeping done really quickly. Same as when you're out marking calves as they're born, for example. If you're popping tags in, just take a photo of it and add it to the notes function on your phone, and then you've got an immediate record as well. So there is some fairly handy things that you can do that are easily at your fingertips as well. Here's an example of the chemical inventory record keeping example, again from the ISC record keeping templates. Again, you can ask your supplier to add the product batch number and expiry date to the invoice for your treatment records. But the examples here, the type of information is the date that the product was received on farm, the product name and the quantity, the expiry date or the date of manufacture, batch number, and who would have been, so the updated by, so who took receipt of that product and put it into the chemical store, for example. Again, these types of records are required for your farm chemical user course as well. So make sure that you don't necessarily think that you've got to do duplicate records here, that if you're keeping one lot of records, it should be sufficient for both programs. So the next requirement that we'll take a look at is stock foods, fodder crops, grain and pasture treatments. Now for this particular requirement, you must guarantee that animals are not exposed to foods containing chemical contamination or fed animal products. Now to meet this requirement, you need to keep records of all agricultural chemical treatments as well, so not just livestock treatments. You need to document any introduced stock feed. You need to have management systems to identify livestock that may have become contaminated. You need to map or list any treated or contaminated sites, and you should also try and source and file a commodity vendor declaration that accompany any introduced stock feed. So an example here of the crop, pasture and paddock treatment record. So the types of information that you would be capturing here is the date of application, the paddock and the location, the crop that was treated, how much area was treated, who it was treated by, what the application rate was and the method, there was any wind direction and speed, and then details around the tank mix as well. So product name, chemical rate, your batch number, withholding period, that type of information. Again, similar to the livestock treatment, the date that the safe to harvest or safe to graze a particular crop, and then any notes. So you'll see that this type of information has application across the business as well, and there's a couple of areas where I could see that this could become useful. So if, for example, there was a spray drift incident, you would be able to demonstrate through capturing your records what the actual conditions were on the day, for example. Other issues might be if you do have a adverse reaction or a grazing incident, something like that. Again, you've got those records, or it might also be useful if you had a work health and safety issue as well. So these records, whilst they're important and a requirement as part of LPA, certainly have a practical application across other areas of your business. This example here on the slide is around a grain and fodder treatment record. So this is when hay and silage may have been treated. So again, things like the date, the silage or the storage ID, the product that was treated, the amount that was treated, the application rate, who did it, and whether or not they were owner, employee or contractor, and then information about the chemicals. So the actual product, the rate, the batch number, withholding period, etc., the date the produce is safe to be fed out, and then any other information as well. This example of the screen here is around introduced stock feed. So this is grain and hay and or pellets and commercially produced materials that you might be bringing on farm to feed out. So again, the information you'd like to be capturing here is the date, the feed stuff and how much you received, where it came from, whether or not you had a commodity vendor deck or an equivalent reference number, whether there was any residue analysis provided with that material and where you stored it, and then again, who took receipt of it on farm or who created the records. And similarly, there's also a requirement to keep the livestock feeding records. And again, this has got very practical use across the business. So for example, if you're looking at different mobs, for example, or different areas of the property, then you can look back over a time frame and see what totals are. You might like to capture other information such as cost, and that could also be very helpful when it comes to doing gross margins and cost of production and things like that as well. So these, again, all types of records that you would be keeping anyway, but it's just making sure that you're also meeting those requirements as part of the LPA program. So a description of the feed stuff, where it was stored, what was fed out, the feeding period from start to finish, and then the person responsible for activity. And this could be quite useful, again, if you had an animal health incident on farm and you needed to go back and work out what it was and where it came from and storage and things like that. On the screen here now is an example of a commodity vendor declaration. Now, all introduced stock feed should be accompanied by a commodity vendor deck to guarantee that the feed purchased is safe from chemical contamination. Now, the commodity vendor deck needs to provide details of the chemical used to treat the commodity, the rate and date of application, and any details around the withholding period or the export slaughter interval from the label. Now, in the absence, if you can't get a commodity vendor deck, then you need to assess the risk and keep a record of that risk. Or you can just apply a standard 60-day withholding period from the date that you actually received the product. Alternatively, you could also have a sample tested for residues of the produce itself. Now, in the post-webinar email, we'll provide you with some more information about commodity vendor declarations. Now, commodity vendor decks are only for hay and grain, for example. Pellets and commercially manufactured feeds don't require a commodity vendor deck. The next LPA requirement is preparation for dispatch of livestock. And for this one, you need to guarantee that livestock are fit to transport and ensure that they experience minimal stress and contamination during assembly and transport. Now, to meet this requirement, you need to ensure that all livestock are fit to load. You need to record transport details, including the vehicle registration and key times. You need to document and file your LPA national vendor decks, and you need to record reports of animals which may have been exposed to any physical contaminants. Now, the integrity insight there is to keep a copy handy of the is the animal fit to load guide, or the fit to load guide. It's got some really handy pictures in there in terms of what actually constitutes fit to load and what doesn't, particularly around things like cancers, other injuries that you might have previously thought were okay to, in particular, end up in a sale yard, and very useful for condition scoring and checking what's appropriate and fit to load, particularly in dry times. So there's an example on the screen now of a preparation of livestock for dispatch record. So things here that you should be keeping an eye on is the date, the number of livestock to be loaded or to be moved, the description, of course, the date and time of yarding, and the date and time of dispatch, and any comments that might have been there. And you'll see that when you're keeping these records, that these are the types of information now that you will actually need to be able to refer to when filling in your national vendor deck, and that they should sort of complement each other. Absolutely. So, livestock transactions and movements. For this requirement, you must guarantee that animals sold are not exposed to any food safety hazards and that they meet all traceability requirements should a safety issue occur. So the way that you do this to meet those requirements is that you need to record all purchases and sales. You need to keep copies of all LPA national vendor decks. You need to record the vendor's name, address and PIC. You need to record livestock details in the description, keep records of all animals purchased while within a withholding period or export slaughter interval, and you need to document the detail of any animals that may have been exposed to physical contaminants. Now, the biggest tip to stand by what you sell in regards to that particular requirement and also the whole LPA program is to make sure that every NVD is filled out so that it is clear, complete and correct. Now, the questions in Part A of the National Vendor Deck are often where producers need a bit of a hand. Now, these questions are about the animal's history. This information is crucial for food safety and market access. So the key here is to stay on the safe side. And if in doubt, tick yes and check your records to be sure. Now, the only question where you shouldn't tick yes is around the livestock ownership. So if you bred the livestock, you tick yes. If you purchased one or more animals within a particular consignment that is covered by that NVD, then you need to tick no and indicate the most recent date of purchase. Now, a couple of other things to note is that sometimes the consignee and the destination may be different and have a different property identification code. And it's really important that you identify this on the LPA National Vendor Deck. Now, in the consigned to section, you need to record the full name and address of the person and or company that the livestock are being consigned to. And as I said, sometimes that's actually different to the physical location. And a really good example of that is when transporting livestock to be sold at a sale yard. So the consignee would be your livestock agent and the destination is the sale yard location. Now, we've got lots of tips for filling in the NVD so it is clear, complete and correct, and we'll share those with you after the webinar. The final step for Part A in the NVD is the declaration. Now, just a reminder, when you tick the box on your LPA NVD and you sign it, that you are guaranteeing that your on-farm practices meet those LPA requirements and ultimately our customer expectations. So your tick must be backed up by accurate farm records. Now, for those of you who are LPA accredited, you also have access to the faster, easier ENVD system. It's more accurate than paper forms and ensures that the latest version of the NVD is always being used. It reduces time and duplication spent completing livestock assurance and health declarations. It reduces the cost of storing and retrieving historical consignments for auditing or for reporting and other admin purposes. And you also don't need to wait for new NVD books to arrive. And stakeholders along the supply chain can also log in and view any consignments, including those that are receiving consignments of animals. Now, the other thing that's really important in terms of this livestock movements requirement is being able to record livestock movements through the National Livestock Identification System database. And it's really important that you do that to remain LPA accredited. Now, if a producer is selected to participate in an audit, the auditor will review whether all the transfers for livestock moved onto the PIC have been recorded, and failure to do that will be recorded as a non-conformance by the auditor and may actually lead to suspension of an LPA accreditation, which then also removes access to national vendor decks. Now, the integrity insight there is that state legislation also requires that the buyer or receiver of the livestock completes the transfer on the database, as we've just talked about in our little poll question, and penalties may be imposed by the state and territory government for failing to complete these as required. So an example there on the screen now of some records around livestock purchases and movements. So the types of information that you're capturing there is the date, the serial number from the NVD, the number of stock and the destination paddock, information around the breed, the sex, and the vendor name and address. So this is for animals that are coming onto the property, and any notes associated with those. Similarly, you might have an example. So this is for livestock moving off the property. So this would be livestock sales and movements. Again, the date, the serial number of the national vendor deck, the number of stock and the paddock of origin, the breed, sex, destination. And it might also be handy for this sort of information if you also wanted to capture deaths as well on farm, and that would certainly help you with your PIC reconciliation later on. And we will be doing some future webinars around NLIS, and we'll be able to take you through some NLIS deep dive and some tips there for keeping up-to-date records on the NLIS. So just to finish up, I guess we just wanted to take you through what actually is involved with an LPA audit. And the key thing there is don't panic, that audits are about identifying areas for practical on-farm improvement. As I said earlier, it is a condition of accreditation that producers agree to participate in an audit process, and that LPA audits are conducted each year to ensure that management systems are introduced by livestock producers that comply with those rules and standards of the Livestock Production Assurance Program. All LPA accredited producers may be audited, and approximately 3,000 audits are done each year. And as part of that, if you are asked to participate in an audit, that your LPA records will be reviewed. So it's important to make sure that they're accurate and up to date. Now, what if issues are identified during an audit? Well, if the issue is minor, then the auditor may record what's called an observation, which means that the producer needs to take some action to improve the relevant practice. And things such as not obtaining a commodity vendor deck for purchase fodder, or not correctly completing an NVD, for example, where the destination and the consignee have different addresses, that might result in an observation being listed. However, if the issue is more significant, then the auditor may raise what's referred to as a corrective action request. And this means that as a producer, you actually need to take action to ensure compliance with the relevant requirement and submit evidence of that to close out the corrective action. Now, a common CAR or corrective action request is where there's no biosecurity plan in place, or where there's discrepancies between NVDs and NLIS transfers on the database. Now, the important thing to note there is that CARs can now be managed by emailing the required evidence directly to the auditor, or you can actually upload the evidence to your LPA account now. And that's a recently added feature to the LPA Service Centre. The tip there for you, the insight is you can access the how to respond to an LPA corrective action request fact sheet on the Integrity Systems website. We'll circulate a link after the webinar, and that image up there on the screen just shows you a screenshot of the how-to guide and what the service centre actually looks like as well for managing your audits. So just to finish up, where do you go for more information to help you through your record keeping? There's lots of information on the ISC website, including the templates for record keeping, the checklists for how you meet each of those requirements for the program. There's also lots of information now on the LPA Service Centre as well, including the ability to upload your online records or completing your biosecurity plan and your risk assessment completely online. You can also keep up to date with us through Integrity Matters, which is our monthly email, which just for everybody's information, you'll keep an eye out for it now. It's due to go out tomorrow. We're also on social and digital, so Facebook, Twitter, and we have some great resources now on YouTube as well. And just before I do finish up and we go to a couple of questions, just the usual disclaimer, but in particular the NVD, just to remember that it is a declaration and it's your declaration. We can't do it for you. Your livestock agent can't do it for you. But we're certainly here to help you and provide you with information to make it as easy as possible.